It was the month of March in the year 1933 when the air in Washington carried both a chill of late winter and the trembling hope of a nation bent beneath hardship. The crowd gathered, restless yet reverent, as Franklin Delano Roosevelt laid his hand upon the Bible and spoke the words that would bind him to the presidency. Among those who watched from afar was his mother, Sara Delano Roosevelt, sitting at Hyde Park in the old house that had witnessed her long guardianship of his life. Though she was not in the public square, her gaze seemed to stretch across distance and ceremony alike, for she had always stood as a quiet sentinel over the course of her son's days. She had been the keeper of his childhood, the steward of his fortune, the guardian of his marriage, and, in ways not easily measured, the sculptor of his destiny. Welcome, dear listener. As you rest with me tonight, share in the comments where you are listening from and at what hour of your evening, of yore. Together we form a memory across the world. Do not forget to subscribe so our journey may continue. And so let us begin, not in the shadow of the White House nor even in the halls of Hyde Park, but in the quiet dawn of another time, in the year 1854, when a girl was born into the Delano family. Her name, Sara Ann Delano, a name wrapped in the grace of New England and the breath of the sea. She arrived into a lineage that was already heavy with wealth, trade, and worldly ventures. For the Delanos had traveled oceans, sent ships across to China, and carried silks, porcelains, and stories back to their homes. To be born among such a people was to be wrapped from the first moment in the folds of privilege. And yet, beneath the folds, one may wonder what seeds of character took root in the silence of her nursery. Sara was the seventh of 11 children, and though the house was large, filled with voices and the measured rhythm of family affairs, she learned early that to stand out among so many, one must cultivate presence rather than noise. Her father, Warren Delano II, had made and lost fortunes in the opium trade in China, and though the subject was not spoken of in open pride, its fruits were visible in the broad rooms, the carved furniture, and the knowledge that prosperity could vanish and return with the swiftness of tides. It is said that children hear even what is left unsaid, and so Sara must have grown with a deep awareness that wealth was not eternal, that fortune was as shifting as the sea that had carried her father eastward. Did this give her the quiet resolve she later displayed, the unyielding desire to protect and secure whatever she possessed? One can only ponder. Her early years were spent in Newburgh, New York, where the air was crisp with the scents of the Hudson River and the whispers of orchards upon the surrounding hills. The Delano household was elegant but not idle, and Sara was taught the arts of refinement. Needlework, piano, language, and scripture formed the tapestry of her days, while her mind took in the measured expectations of her place in society. She was not a girl destined for obscurity. She carried herself with the knowledge of lineage, the posture of one aware that her family had walked corridors of both commerce and distinction. And yet the young girl was not merely ornamental. Accounts later suggest that Sara bore a strength of will unusual for her age and sex, that she absorbed not only the soft teachings of drawing rooms, but the firmer lessons of resilience handed down from a father who had rebuilt after ruin. As she grew, the stories of the Delano voyages to China filled her imagination. Her father spoke of ports filled with strange fragrances, of lantern-lit streets, of markets where ivory, spices, and silk changed hands in dazzling quantities. Though Sara herself was not to tread those distant lands as a child, she absorbed them into the inner theater of her mind. To her, the world was wide, yet it could be bent toward the hands of those who dared to shape it. Perhaps it was this sense of scope, this awareness that families could rise and fall upon the currents of oceans, that later informed her view of Franklin's path. For to her, the life of her son would be no ordinary walk through fields and modest towns. It would be a voyage, one that demanded vigilance and guidance. The seasons of her youth passed in a rhythm of privilege, yet shadows occasionally brushed across them. The financial ruin that had once befallen her father left behind a caution that no wealth was beyond the reach of loss. The Civil War years marked her adolescence, and though the Delanos remained secure, the nation itself was torn by conflict and division. One imagines Sara walking the grounds of her family's estate, hearing the distant toll of war news, and quietly resolving that security must be guarded not only with wealth, but with will. Such quiet reflections were not recorded in letters, yet in the formation of her later character, we sense the imprint of these years. By the time she reached young womanhood, Sara had become not only graceful but commanding. She was described by some as tall, composed, with a presence that filled a room without effort. She learned to speak in the gentle cadences expected of a woman of her class, yet beneath the softness lay an unbending determination. In the stillness of drawing rooms, she practiced a form of authority that was more lasting than raised voices, an authority conveyed through the calm certainty that others would bend before her will. Or, it is said that the roots of destiny often appear in the smallest of details, and so we may imagine her, a young woman, standing upon the banks of the Hudson at twilight, the waters stretching wide before her, the evening wind carrying the scent of orchards and river mud. Did she wonder, in that moment, what life would ask of her? Did she sense that she would one day be known not only for her own station, but as the mother of a man who would command a nation? The river gave no answer. It only flowed on, silent and inevitable, as all rivers do. As night fell over Newburgh, the girl who would become the matriarch of Hyde Park listened to the faint rush of water beyond her window. In the cradle of wealth, in the echo of voyages to far seas, in the unspoken awareness of fragility and strength interwoven, Sara Delano took her first steps into the long path of life. The sea had spoken through her father, the river through her childhood, and from these waters her resolve began to form. The sound of the river lingered in her ears, like a secret voice shaping her spirit, and when she closed her eyes, she could almost hear the distant sea her father had known. In this mingling of rivers and oceans, she carried forward into womanhood a figure soon to encounter both love and command. The sound of the carriage departing into twilight lingers like a thread of memory. Wheels rolling over gravel, a horse's breath rising in the cool air, and a figure within carried toward the unfolding years of young womanhood. That carriage might have been one of many, for the Delano family traveled between their various homes, balancing life along the Hudson with excursions into the wider world of Boston and New York. Yet to Sara, each journey was more than the distance between places. It was a passage between states of being, each departure leading her into new corridors of responsibility and expectation. One imagines her face lit by a lantern's glow within the carriage, her thoughts silent, her hands folded in her lap as she felt the sway of the road, preparing herself for the chapters to come. She was no longer the child who had listened to tales of China by her father's side. She was becoming the young woman whose own life would soon draw the attention of families and suitors alike. In the New England of her youth, a young lady of standing was measured not only by her accomplishments of refinement, but by her ability to represent the honor of her household. For Sara, the education of drawing rooms and parlors was more than the recital of piano notes or the needle's thread upon cloth. It was the preparation for the great and subtle art of navigating society, of presenting dignity without arrogance, grace without hesitation. She moved in circles where every glance and word was weighted, where one's bearing could shape alliances and determine the future of households. And though she absorbed these expectations with outward calm, within her there must have stirred a quiet knowledge that she was destined not to follow, but to direct. How often did she watch her mother's gentle ways, her father's resolute command, and ask herself how such qualities might one day be joined within her own life. The orchards and gardens of Newburgh offered her both beauty and solitude. Among rows of trees heavy with blossoms in spring or apples in autumn, she could walk beneath shifting light, accompanied only by the hum of bees and the distant murmur of the river. These walks gave her time to form her thoughts, and though no diary records her reflections, we may sense them in the firmness of her later character. In such solitude, she must have asked herself what it means to belong to a family of wealth in a country still shaping its identity. Was privilege a gift to be enjoyed or a charge to be guarded? Was she to be a passive ornament within her society, or the quiet force shaping those around her? The blossoms fell, the fruit ripened and was gathered, yet the questions remained like roots beneath the soil, feeding her resolve. By the late 1860s and early 1870s, Sara's family stood secure once more after earlier financial losses, and she came into adulthood as a figure of elegance. Accounts speak of her as tall and striking, with a natural dignity that needed no adornment of extravagance. She carried the Delano name with a balance of pride and restraint, embodying the lesson that true influence lies not in what is proclaimed, but in what is silently assumed. Those who met her remembered her calm presence, her ability to listen with attentive stillness, and her manner of speech that never hurried. This stillness was not weakness but control, as though she measured every response with care, allowing others to reveal themselves while she kept her own counsel. In those same years, the larger world was stirring. The nation, only recently torn by civil war, was pushing westward, rebuilding industries, and shaping a new social order. For families like the Delanos, the question was how to sustain their prominence in a time of such change. Marriages were not simply unions of affection, they were bridges between houses, alliances woven through wealth and name. It was within this atmosphere that Sara met James Roosevelt of Hyde Park. He was a man already seasoned by life, older than she by decades, established in wealth and position. To some, the match might have seemed unlikely, yet for Sara, it carried the assurance of stability, a household of consequence, and the chance to command her own sphere. Did she feel, as the carriage wheels bore her toward the first meetings with James, that she was stepping into a destiny larger than herself? Or was it only the quiet knowledge that she, like her mother and grandmothers before her, would fulfill the expectation of her station? The prospect of marriage drew her deeper into the currents of society. She must have attended gatherings where lamps glowed against polished wood, where music rose from string ensembles, where conversations turned on politics, trade, and the shifting fortunes of families. Within such rooms, Sara's calm presence would have been noted. She was not one to flutter or seek notice. She carried herself with the assurance of one who need not demand attention, for attention came naturally to her. And in James Roosevelt she found not the excitement of youth, but the gravity of position, a man who embodied the stability her own father had lost and regained. It is here that the path of her life turned from daughter of the Delanos to the mistress of Hyde Park. As the carriage rolled on through the twilight, we imagine the young Sara watching the trees blur into darkness, her thoughts quiet yet steady. Was she prepared to join her life to a man so much her senior, to step into the role of wife, mistress, and soon mother? Perhaps she told herself, as so many before her had done, that love may take many forms, and that the greatest love is not always passion but purpose. The road stretched on, and with each mile she left behind the innocence of girlhood and drew nearer to the solemn responsibilities that would one day shape not only her household, but the destiny of her only child. The twilight deepened into night, and the sound of the carriage became softer, blending into the silence of the countryside. Yet the image remains, a young woman borne forward, poised between the past of her childhood and the unfolding chapters of her life. The horse's breath faded into darkness. The wheels slowed, and at last the carriage drew up to a grand house whose doors would open upon her future. The image of the bride standing in a vast house remains, a figure poised in the threshold of Hyde Park, her gown trailing softly upon polished floors, her eyes cast upward to ceilings that seemed to stretch into the weight of centuries. It was 1880 when Sara Delano became the wife of James Roosevelt, and the house that had belonged to him long before her now stood as both her dwelling and her domain. The marriage joined not only two individuals, but two strands of New York society, the established Roosevelts of the Hudson Valley and the mercantile Delanos of New England. To the world, the union was fitting, dignified, and advantageous, though to those who looked closer, it bore also the mark of age and disparity. James was 26 years older than Sara, a man already seasoned with the habits of wealth and the gravity of position, while she was still in her 20s, fresh from the sheltered drawing rooms of her family estate. Yet within this gap, there formed a bond that would define the course of her life. Marriage in such households was less a private arrangement than a public covenant. The rooms of Hyde Park echoed with formality, the routines of staff, the expectations of lineage. Sara, stepping into these halls, did not shrink beneath their weight. She carried herself with composure, learning swiftly the rhythms of command. A mistress of a house was not simply a hostess. She was the unseen hand that governed servants, arranged affairs, and maintained the balance between grace and discipline. In her early years as James's wife, Sara proved adept at this role, her natural dignity fitting the responsibilities with ease. She understood that her position was not only to accompany her husband, but to preserve and advance the Roosevelt name, and she did so with a determination that would later astonish even those closest to her. And yet, behind the stately presence, one wonders what her heart felt. Did she regard James with affection, admiration, or merely duty? Accounts describe him as kindly and respected, a man of education and refinement, but also one marked by the slower rhythms of age. To stand beside him must have been to accept a life less driven by youthful passion than by established order. Perhaps this suited Sara, for she had never been one to flutter or seek excitement. Her strength lay in control, in the assurance that life could be guided by firmness of will. Still, in the quiet of evenings, as she moved through the vast rooms of Hyde Park, she must at times have felt the solitude of a marriage bound by expectation rather than fervor. The silence of the house after guests departed, the long corridors lit by dim lamps, may have stirred within her a longing not spoken aloud. The years of their union unfolded with dignity, if not brilliance. Sara accompanied James in his duties, upheld the traditions of their household, and extended hospitality with the grace expected of her position. Hyde Park became not merely a residence, but a symbol of their standing, its wide lawns and river views reflecting the stability of their lives. Yet beneath this surface, Sara carried a quiet hope. For years, the couple remained childless, and the prospect of an heir seemed to fade with each passing season. It is not difficult to imagine her walks along the riverbank, her prayers whispered in the stillness of the church, her heart bearing both resignation and yearning. In those days, a woman's worth in such families was often measured by her ability to continue the line, and though Sara commanded respect, the absence of children must have weighed heavily. Then, after more than 2 decades of James's life already passed before their marriage, and several years of waiting thereafter, a child was conceived. In 1882, the house at Hyde Park was filled with anticipation. When the boy was born on January 30th, the joy was immense. They named him Franklin Delano Roosevelt, weaving both paternal and maternal names into his identity, as though to bind him from the start to the destinies of both families. For Sara, the birth of this only child transformed her existence. She was no longer merely the wife of an older husband, the mistress of an established house. She was the mother of a son, the guardian of a future. In her arms she held not only an infant, but the embodiment of all her hopes and purposes. The role of motherhood, once delayed, became to her an all-consuming devotion. Franklin was her sole child, and perhaps for that reason, her love and vigilance gathered around him with extraordinary intensity. She protected him, guided him, and shaped his early years with a hand that was both tender and firm. Those who later observed her remarked upon her unyielding presence in his life, a presence born in part from the knowledge that there would be no other children to divide her care. Every dream, every ambition, every measure of pride she possessed would be poured into this one son. It is worth pausing to reflect upon the nature of such devotion. Is it a blessing to be the sole focus of a mother's gaze, to be cherished without rival? Or does such closeness bind as much as it nurtures, shaping a life with invisible cords that cannot easily be cut? In the cradle, Franklin must have felt only warmth and protection. But as he grew, the force of his mother's love became a guiding current, strong and steady, carrying him forward even when he might have sought other shores. Was it possible, one wonders, for such a bond ever to loosen? The household at Hyde Park adjusted itself to the rhythms of the child. Servants stepped softly, rooms echoed with laughter and play, and Sara herself dedicated much of her day to his upbringing. James, already advanced in years, found in the boy a renewal of life, yet the primary influence remained Sara's. She determined his hours, his lessons, his companions, and even his amusements. From the start, Franklin lived not as a boy of unguarded freedom, but as the heir to a mother's carefully constructed vision. The image of the bride in the vast house thus transforms into the image of the mother by the cradle, her eyes steady, her will already shaping the course of another life. The halls of Hyde Park, once filled with echoes of silence, now resounded with the steps of a child, but always under the watch of Sara's presence. For in her heart she had determined that her son would not be ordinary. He would rise, as the Delanos had risen, as the Roosevelts had stood in prominence, and perhaps, though she could not yet know how, he would carry her guiding hand into realms beyond her imagining. The sound of the cradle rocking lingers, a gentle creak in the quiet night, the rhythm of a destiny beginning, a mother's watch unbroken. It is in that sound, soft and steady, that we leave this part of her story, moving from the hush of a bride's solitude into the warmth of a mother's unyielding devotion. The cradle rocking in dim lamplight sets the rhythm, a sound both tender and unrelenting, as though the wooden frame itself carried the pulse of Sara's will. Each sway back and forth seemed to affirm her purpose. This child, her only child, would be guarded against all frailty, against all uncertainty, against the world itself if need be. Within the small circle of lamplight, Franklin's infant face lay calm, eyes fluttering beneath closed lids, unaware of the gaze fixed upon him with unwavering constancy. The house at Hyde Park, with its broad halls and ancestral portraits, seemed to narrow itself into that single room, the cradle at its center, the mother watching. Outside the windows, the Hudson drifted under the moonlight, carrying with it the long memory of the land. But inside, Sara carried her own tide, a current that would shape the boy's destiny more surely than any river. Motherhood for Sara was not the distracted affection of one who shares her heart among many children. It was the single devotion of one whose hopes were bound to one life alone. She rose with him, planned for him, and ordered the household to circle around his needs. The servants, though bound to their tasks by duty, understood that their true command came from the lady of the house, who insisted upon order and exactitude. Franklin's nursery was immaculate, his meals chosen with precision, his lessons in speech and manners guided from the earliest years. Even before the boy could speak, Sara had already begun to carve a path for him, one that would lead away from idleness and toward a life she deemed worthy of his name. The absence of siblings created an intimacy between mother and son that was both profound and possessive. Franklin was the sole companion of her maternal heart, and she was the unquestioned guardian of his days. When he toddled across the polished floors, her eyes followed. When he stumbled, her hand steadied him. When he laughed, her smile answered. Yet beneath the warmth, there lay also the weight of expectation. To her, Franklin was not merely a child to be cherished, but a vessel into which she poured her will. He would carry forward not only the Roosevelt name, but the Delano discipline, the lessons of fortune gained and lost, the unyielding resolve that she herself had learned in her youth. In those tender years, she was already shaping him as one might shape clay, firming his edges, steadying his form. James Roosevelt, though present and affectionate, was older and more detached. He enjoyed his son, but did not command his life with the same intensity. His role was that of benevolent father, a presence of calm authority. But it was Sara who decided the course of Franklin's days. Those who later observed the family remarked that the boy was more his mother's than his father's child, for it was she who defined his environment, she who nurtured his character, she who instilled in him the habits of confidence and poise. In the evenings, as James retired early or busied himself with affairs, Sara would sit by the cradle or read beside the fire, her son upon her lap, the bond between them tightening with each passing season. As Franklin grew beyond infancy, the nursery became a schoolroom, and Sara its governess. She believed strongly that manners and discipline must be formed from the beginning, and so the boy was taught to sit properly, to speak clearly, to greet his elders with courtesy. To some it might have seemed rigorous, yet to Sara it was natural. She believed that a child who learned control early would carry it into every sphere of life. When Franklin resisted, as all children do, she did not yield. Her patience was long, but her resolve was longer, and the boy learned that his mother's will was not to be bent. Yet he also learned that beneath her firmness was love, a love that never wavered, that enfolded him in protection, even as it guided him toward her chosen path. The house itself mirrored her influence. She oversaw its running with meticulous care, ensuring that meals were served with precision, that rooms were orderly, that the gardens reflected refinement rather than neglect. Franklin grew up in an atmosphere of orderliness, where everything had its place and every action its measure. This environment gave him a sense of stability, of a world governed not by chaos but by intention. And yet, one may wonder if it also left him less prepared for disorder, less accustomed to the untamed forces of life beyond Hyde Park. Did Sara, in shielding him so thoroughly, create a distance between him and the rougher textures of the world he would later lead? It is a question without clear answer, for the very discipline she instilled also gave him the confidence to face that world. Her devotion did not exclude moments of tenderness. Sara delighted in her son's laughter, his small triumphs, his first words. She took him into the gardens to see the blossoms, into the orchards to taste the fruit, down to the riverbank to watch the water shimmer in the sun. These moments were imprinted upon Franklin's memory, forming a sense of place and belonging that would remain with him throughout his life. Hyde Park was not merely a house, it was the world of his childhood, a sanctuary of order and affection presided over by the unbreakable figure of his mother. The boy, who later would lead a nation, first learned stability at his mother's side, in the quiet rhythms of home. The cradle, once rocking beneath lamplight, gave way to the bed where Franklin slept as a boy, but the watch of Sara's eyes remained. Even in sleep, she listened for his stirring, ready to comfort or correct, to guide or guard. Her presence was constant, and Franklin grew accustomed to it, never doubting that his mother would be near. This closeness, though reassuring, would later draw the remarks of others who saw in it a possessiveness that seemed to allow little space for independence. Yet for Sara there was no contradiction. To her, devotion and control were one, inseparable, the natural expression of a mother's duty. In the quiet hours when the house lay still and the lamps burned low, Sara would sometimes sit beside her son's bed and reflect upon what lay ahead. She could not foresee the distant years when he would speak before crowds, command armies, and shape the fate of nations. But she sensed, perhaps instinctively, that he was destined for more than ordinary life. Her task, as she saw it, was to prepare him, to shape his character, to instill in him the strength to rise. Whether this sense was born of maternal pride or prophetic intuition, we cannot say, yet it guided her actions, lending them the certainty of purpose. As seasons turned and Franklin's childhood unfolded, Sara remained the steady axis around which his world revolved. The cradle that had once rocked him to sleep was set aside, yet the rhythm of her watchfulness continued. She had bound her life to his, and in so doing, bound his life to hers. The rocking of the cradle had ceased, but in its place came the steady beat of her footsteps through the halls, the sound of her voice shaping his thoughts, the presence of her will guiding his every step. As the sound of the cradle rocking fades, replaced now by the creak of a heavy lock turning, for soon sorrow would come to Hyde Park, and widowhood would draw Sara into yet another role, one that would deepen her resolve and harden her grip upon her son's future. The key turns and the door of life closes upon one chapter even as it opens to another. The sound of the key turning in a heavy lock lingers in the memory, as if the door of the old Hyde Park house had closed upon a chapter of companionship and opened into a long corridor of solitude. For in the year 1900, James Roosevelt, Sara's elder husband, laid down the weight of his years and departed from the life that had bound them together. He had been kind, steady, and gentle, but his time had always belonged more to the past than to the future. When death claimed him, it left behind not only the echo of absence, but also the vast responsibility of household, estate, and son. Sara, now a widow at 46, faced the world with her child still in the tender years of youth, and the mantle of guardianship passed wholly to her hands. She closed the lock upon her chamber of grief and stepped forward into the wider rooms of command. The widow's black garments did not dull the fire of her determination. If anything, they became a visible sign of her authority, a presence that filled each corridor with a mixture of solemnity and strength. She had known loss before, through family, fortunes, and shifting tides of history, but this loss carried both sorrow and empowerment. Without James, no second voice tempered her rule. The estate at Hyde Park, the servants, the accounts, the rhythms of daily life, all fell directly under her eye. And at the center of it all was Franklin, 18 years old, tall and fresh-faced, soon to enter his years of higher learning. To him, the death of his father was softened, perhaps, by the unwavering solidity of his mother. For she would not allow grief to unsteady the course she had already set. Widowhood, in her class and time, could be a period of withdrawal. Many women retreated into quiet piety, relinquishing authority to sons or male relatives. Yet Sara did the opposite. She assumed the full dignity of matriarch, commanding with calm certainty the affairs of Hyde Park. She was no longer merely the wife who supported a household. She was the household itself, its sustaining pillar. Every decision passed through her hands. Every change was weighed by her judgment. Those who worked within the house and grounds spoke of her fairness, but also of her firmness. She tolerated no disorder, no laxity, no whisper of neglect. The very air of the estate seemed infused with her presence, as if the trees themselves bent slightly in acknowledgement of her rule. And yet beyond the walls, the world was changing. The 20th century dawned with all its promises and uncertainties. The nation was moving toward greater industry, greater conflict, greater complexity. Franklin, stepping into young adulthood, would be called into this changing tide. But before he could venture outward, Sara resolved that he must be prepared inwardly. She oversaw his education with meticulous attention, ensuring that his time at Groton had shaped him in discipline, and that his path to Harvard would be one of honor and diligence. Letters between mother and son reveal her unbroken presence in his life. Even as he studied away from home, she advised, guided, and corrected, her words carrying the same weight as her presence once had in the nursery. Franklin, though surrounded by peers and masters, always returned in spirit to the counsel of his mother. It is easy, from the distance of history, to question whether her hand was too heavy, whether the lock she had turned upon her widow's chamber also locked her son within the confines of her will. Some observers believed she smothered him, that she allowed him too little independence, that he could not breathe without her permission. Others, however, saw in her guidance the very foundation of his confidence, the structure without which he might have faltered. The truth, as so often, rests somewhere between, for Franklin did grow under her watch into a young man of poise, charm, and ambition, yet the imprint of her authority never faded, even when he stood upon the highest stages of the world. Within Hyde Park, Sara maintained a rhythm of life that was both austere and gracious. She entertained with dignity, preserving the Roosevelt name in society. She managed the estates with prudence, ensuring that fortunes were not squandered. She upheld traditions with unbending resolve, believing that continuity itself was a safeguard against decline. Franklin witnessed this daily, absorbing not only the comforts of wealth, but the responsibilities of stewardship. To be a Roosevelt was not, in his mother's eyes, to indulge, but to maintain, to govern, to embody the quiet force of leadership. Whether in arranging dinner tables, directing the planting of gardens, or settling accounts, Sara modeled for her son the art of command. And yet, in the quiet of her rooms, did she ever feel the shadow of loneliness? The absence of James must have left a silence in the evenings when the fire burned low and Franklin was away at his studies. The matriarch's duties filled the hours, but solitude may have crept into the corners. Perhaps it was this solitude that bound her even more tightly to her son, for he remained the one constant presence, the one reason her days had structure beyond duty. She could not risk losing him to waywardness, nor to the distractions of society. He was her purpose, her legacy, her continuation. If she seemed possessive, it was because he was the sole vessel of her heart. In those years after James's death, Franklin matured into a young man admired by his peers. Tall, cheerful, and confident, he carried into Harvard the assurance that comes from a secure home and a vigilant parent. Yet behind his charm lay the steady influence of Sara's guidance. Friends noticed her frequent letters, her advice on everything from courses to conduct. She encouraged him to join societies but warned against excess. She admired his ambitions but reminded him of responsibility. Her words, always measured, were less suggestions than directives, and Franklin, though eager for independence, rarely disobeyed. In this delicate balance of mother and son lay the seeds of both admiration and quiet resistance, a tension that would later surface when he chose Eleanor as his wife. For now, however, the widow of Hyde Park reigned with calm assurance. Her lock had turned upon grief, sealing sorrow within, and she moved forward with unbroken will. Those who visited the estate found her composed, stately, and commanding. She did not speak often of James, though his portrait remained in its place, a reminder of the past. Instead, she spoke of Franklin, of his progress, of his future. Her voice carried the certainty that he would rise, that the line she had preserved would continue not merely in wealth, but in influence. She may not have spoken the word destiny, but it hovered unspoken in her gaze. The key that had turned in 1900 marked not only the end of a husband's life, but the full ascension of a widow's authority. Sara Delano Roosevelt, alone yet unbowed, now walked the halls of Hyde Park as its undisputed mistress. Franklin, the young heir, grew beneath her watchful eye, his every step measured by her vision. The house, once filled with the partnership of husband and wife, now echoed with the singular command of a mother and matriarch. the sound of the lock fades, and in its place comes the faint rustle of a folded letter, unsent, lying upon a desk. For soon Sarah's guidance would stretch beyond the estate and into her son's ventures beyond the family gates. The folded but unsent letter rests upon the desk, its paper faintly creased, its ink never committed. Such a letter might have been one of many, for Sara often composed her thoughts before deciding whether to send them to her son. Each word carried weight, each sentence the possibility of shaping his choices. At times she would hold back, trusting that her presence in his memory was enough. At other times she dispatched her counsel with the firmness of one who believed a mother's guidance should not be bound by distance. Whether written or withheld, her influence reached him all the same, for Franklin lived with the knowledge that his mother's thoughts accompanied him always, like an unseen guardian walking beside him even as he stepped into the wider world. At Groton School, Franklin had first learned the discipline of communal life, the cold chapels, the stern masters, the rigors of study and sport. Yet behind all these stood Sara, steady as the hearth at Hyde Park, reminding him through her letters of comportment, of honor, of duty. She had chosen Groton not for ease but for rigor, believing that the Roosevelt heir must be tested, that the comforts of wealth must not soften him. When he complained of hardships, she listened but did not yield, for she believed that endurance was the truest lesson. The folded letters in her desk, unsent yet contemplated, suggest the inner struggle of a mother torn between sympathy and purpose. She wished to comfort him, yet she feared that too much comfort would weaken the steel she sought to forge. Thus she sometimes folded her compassion into silence, choosing to let him grow strong through solitude. When Franklin entered Harvard, Sara's role became both more distant and more insistent. He was a young man now, moving among peers of wealth and ambition, exploring the pleasures of society, tasting the independence that youth craves. Yet Sara's letters continued, offering praise when deserved, admonition when needed, and always the reminder that he carried not only his own name but hers as well. She had poured her life into his, and now she expected return. Franklin, for all his charm, was not free of her shadow. He attended gatherings, played sports, edited the Crimson, yet in his heart he knew that his mother's eyes, though miles away, followed him still. He may have folded her letters with a smile or a sigh, but he did not disregard them. Her counsel had become a second conscience, a voice that measured his choices even in moments when he thought himself most free. Visitors to Hyde Park during these years often remarked upon the depth of Sara's devotion. Though Franklin was away, his presence seemed never absent. She spoke of him often, shared his accomplishments, recounted his letters, and even described his moods as though she still lived at his side. The folded letter on her desk was more than paper. It was a symbol of the unbroken bond, the invisible thread that tied mother and son across distance. Some may have called it overbearing, yet for Sara it was natural. How could she, who had lost her husband and borne only one child, not invest herself entirely in him? To her, Franklin was not only son but companion, legacy, and future. She guarded him fiercely, even from afar. As Franklin's independence grew, the tension between mother's guidance and son's freedom deepened. He enjoyed the company of friends, the pleasures of society, the attention of women. Sara watched this with both pride and concern. She wanted him to be admired, yet she feared he might be distracted. She valued ambition, yet she dreaded folly. Thus she wrote often, reminding him of duty, urging him toward seriousness, steering him toward choices that would preserve his standing. Franklin accepted her guidance with a mixture of obedience and quiet resistance. He did not wish to wound her, for he loved her deeply, but he also longed to carve his own path. The unsent letters suggest the moments when Sara, too, felt this tension, when she struggled between command and release, between holding too tightly and letting him breathe. The education she envisioned for him extended beyond classrooms. She wanted him to learn the art of society, the grace of leadership, the skill of diplomacy. To this end, she introduced him to circles of influence, guided his manners, and even corrected his attire. Franklin's charm and confidence, often noted by his contemporaries, bore the unmistakable mark of Sarah's training. He knew how to carry himself, how to speak with ease, how to make others feel at home. All lessons taught not by textbooks, but by his mother's example. In Hyde Park's drawing rooms and gardens, she had modeled for him the subtleties of influence, and now he carried them into the broader world. Yet with each step of independence, Sara felt the tug of separation. She remained the center of Hyde Park, commanding its routines, but the boy who had once filled its halls was now away, shaping a life beyond her walls. The folded letter on her desk symbolized the unspoken fear of all mothers, the fear of distance, of change, of being left behind. Did she ever unfold such letters late at night, reread them, and then set them aside with a sigh? Did she ever wonder whether her son would one day belong more to the world than to her? The rustle of paper in the stillness of her room was perhaps the only answer. And yet, even as Franklin grew in independence, he did not sever the bond. He returned often to Hyde Park, finding in its ordered rhythms the stability that college life lacked. He walked again among the orchards, sat beside his mother at the fire, and allowed himself to be her son once more. These returns reassured Sara, confirming that her influence remained intact. She believed with reason that no matter how far he traveled, the foundation she had laid would endure. The folded letters, sent or unsent, were but outward signs of an inward certainty, that she and Franklin were bound in ways that distance could not undo. As his education drew him toward the wider paths of life, law, politics, society, Sara's influence accompanied him like a steady undertone. She had prepared him to rise, to carry himself with confidence, to assume authority with ease. The folded letters were part of this preparation, shaping not only his choices but his awareness of being always observed, always measured. He would enter the world not as an untethered youth, but as the extension of his mother's will. The folded letter lies still, unsent, a quiet symbol of devotion and control. It rustles faintly in the evening air, as though stirred by an unseen hand. And from that rustle comes another sound, faint yet distinct, the clink of silver spoons at a dinner table, where soon Franklin would bring a companion who would alter the balance of his mother's dominion. The letter remains, but the table awaits, and with it the entrance of Eleanor Roosevelt into the carefully guarded world of Sara Delano Roosevelt. The clink of silver spoons at a strained dinner table carries us forward, that small metallic sound, sharper than any spoken word. For in such gatherings, the tension between approval and resistance was often conveyed not in open declarations, but in the rhythm of cutlery, the pauses of silence, the careful choice of phrases uttered across porcelain plates. It was during these years of Franklin's early manhood that he brought into his mother's sight the figure of Eleanor Roosevelt, a quiet young woman whose presence would stir the settled air of Hyde Park like an unexpected breeze. To others, she was Franklin's cousin, a shy yet earnest soul, the orphan child of Elliott Roosevelt, who had known both hardship and displacement. To Sara, however, she was something more complex, both a potential companion for her son and a potential rival for influence within the carefully ordered world she had so long maintained. Eleanor came not with the sheen of wealth or the glamour of society, but with a gravity of spirit that had been formed in loss. Her father, Elliott, beloved yet broken by his struggles, had left her adrift in childhood, and her mother had died young, leaving her in the care of relatives. From such beginnings she carried an air of diffidence, her manner reserved, her beauty understated, her presence quiet rather than commanding. Franklin, with his charm and optimism, seemed to offer her a haven, a partnership that promised stability and affection. Yet for Sara, the prospect of her son's marriage awakened anxieties long dormant. She had been the central presence in his life since birth, the sole guide of his character, the architect of his future. To imagine another woman entering that circle was to imagine the walls of Hyde Park breached, the order she had preserved disrupted. The dinners where Franklin brought Eleanor were marked by politeness, yet beneath the courtesy there stirred currents of unease. Sara observed Eleanor closely, measuring her speech, her manner, her bearing. Did she possess the refinement expected of a Roosevelt wife? Would she uphold the traditions of Hyde Park? Would she strengthen Franklin's standing, or would she diminish it? These questions lay behind every glance, every carefully chosen phrase. For Eleanor, already self-conscious, the weight of such scrutiny must have been heavy. The clink of silver spoons, the quiet shifting of servants in the background, the faint crackle of the fire, all combined to form an atmosphere where words were few, but judgments many. Sara's skepticism was not entirely hidden. Though she extended courtesy, she made clear her reservations. She considered Eleanor too shy, too uncertain, perhaps even too plain for the role of Franklin's wife. In her eyes, her son deserved a companion of greater polish, someone who could match his charm and amplify his presence in society. Yet Franklin, with the quiet confidence of youth, was unmoved. He saw in Eleanor not the deficiencies his mother noted, but the qualities of sincerity, depth, and steadfastness. He was drawn to her gentleness, her intelligence, her sense of duty. Where Sara saw a potential rival, Franklin saw a partner, and in this difference of vision lay the first true strain between mother and son. The courtship unfolded in secrecy at times, for Franklin, aware of his mother's disapproval, sought to protect Eleanor from her scrutiny. Letters were exchanged, meetings arranged, affections deepened. Eleanor, though shy, grew in confidence under Franklin's attention, and he, in turn, delighted in the sense of intimacy that blossomed between them. Sara, however, sensed what was happening, and her unease grew. She had guided Franklin's every step, his schooling, his manners, his pursuits. That he might choose a wife without her full approval seemed a disruption of the natural order she had long commanded. Was it possible that the boy she had shaped so carefully might now step beyond her reach? When the engagement was finally announced, Sara's reaction was measured but cool. Outwardly, she accepted, for to oppose too openly would risk alienating her son. Inwardly, she remained doubtful, even resistant. Yet she possessed the pragmatism of one who knew when to bend rather than break. If Eleanor was to be Franklin's wife, then Sara would ensure that the marriage unfolded within the boundaries of her own authority. She would finance their home, furnish it, even select its arrangements, thereby ensuring that her presence remained within their domestic sphere. She would not relinquish her role. She would simply extend it into the life of her son's new household. Thus the dinners at Hyde Park, once marked by polite tension, gave way to the new reality of Franklin and Eleanor's union. Sara, the matriarch, allowed the marriage to proceed, but she did so on terms that preserved her dominance. Eleanor, stepping into her role as wife, soon discovered that she had not only married Franklin, but also entered into a life overshadowed by her mother-in-law. The clink of silver spoons at those early dinners became the echo of countless future meals where Sara's presence loomed, her opinions voiced, her authority felt. For Eleanor, it was the beginning of a lifelong negotiation, a balance between deference and quiet resistance, between admiration for Sara's strength and resentment of her control. One may wonder, in these moments, how Franklin felt. Did he sense the strain between the two women he loved? Did he feel torn between loyalty to his mother and devotion to his wife? Or did he, with the optimism that defined him, believe that harmony could be maintained, that love would smooth over differences? He smiled, he charmed, he reassured, but beneath the surface he must have known that the conflict was deeper than any smile could resolve. For Sara's hold upon him was not easily loosened, and Eleanor's claim upon him was equally binding. He stood, perhaps unknowingly, at the crossroads of two powerful influences, one rooted in the authority of the past, the other in the promise of the future. The dinners continued, the spoons clinked, the fire crackled, and the air between Sara and Eleanor thickened with unspoken tension. Each woman saw in the other a challenge. Sara determined not to relinquish her authority, Eleanor determined to carve a space of her own. Franklin, at the center, tried to reconcile, yet the strain would persist for decades, shaping the contours of his marriage and the rhythms of his household. The clink of spoons at the strained table was not merely the sound of a single evening, but the faint beginning of a lifelong discord. The sound fades now, leaving behind the image of a door opening, revealing a home newly furnished, identical in many ways to Hyde Park, for Sara had chosen every detail. The door stands open, awaiting Franklin and Eleanor, but behind it stands also the shadow of Sara, ensuring that even in their new home, her presence would remain. The door opening to reveal identical furnishings is more than a threshold into a new household. It is a symbol, subtle yet undeniable, of Sara's hand reaching into her son's marriage. When Franklin and Eleanor moved into their New York residence on East 65th Street, they entered rooms that bore not only the touch of new beginnings, but also the unmistakable imprint of Hyde Park. The carpets, the curtains, the very arrangement of the drawing rooms seemed echoes of Sara's design, as though she had transported the spirit of her own home into theirs. She had financed the house, she had chosen its furnishings, and in doing so, she ensured that her presence would linger within its walls, even when she was not seated by the hearth. Eleanor, stepping across the threshold as a young wife, must have felt both gratitude and a faint sense of displacement, as though the house she entered was already claimed by another's taste. Sara's generosity was unquestionable. Without her resources, Franklin and Eleanor could not have maintained such a residence, nor entertained in the style expected of their station. Yet generosity, when intertwined with control, becomes something more complex. To give is to bind, and Sara's gifts bound her son's household to her will. She was not content to be a distant benefactor. She was an active presence, visiting frequently, offering counsel on domestic matters, even correcting the way Eleanor managed servants or arranged her table. For Eleanor, eager yet inexperienced, such oversight could feel both helpful and suffocating. She learned swiftly that in Sara's world, affection and authority were inseparable, that to accept support was also to accept supervision. Franklin, caught between the two women, often smoothed over tensions with charm and laughter. He loved his mother deeply, respected her judgment, and leaned upon her strength. He also cherished Eleanor, admired her intelligence, and found comfort in her presence. Yet he did not fully grasp the depth of the rivalry that grew between them. To him, perhaps, it seemed natural that his mother should remain close, that her guidance should extend into his married life. After all, she had shaped every part of his existence until then. Why should marriage alter that bond? But for Eleanor, the intrusion was more keenly felt. She had entered marriage with hopes of building a partnership, a home where she might grow into her role as wife and mother. Instead, she discovered that her authority was often eclipsed, her choices questioned, her place never entirely secure. The identical furnishings stood as daily reminders of this dynamic. Each chair, each table, each drapery bore silent witness to the fact that the house was as much Sara's creation as Eleanor's domain. Guests who visited might have admired the elegance, but Eleanor, moving through the rooms, must have sensed the shadow of her mother-in-law in every corner. It is said that even the nursery arrangements bore Sara's influence, with her opinions shaping the care of Franklin and Eleanor's children from their earliest days. She delighted in her grandchildren, no doubt, yet her delight was often accompanied by criticism of Eleanor's methods. Where Eleanor sought to nurture independence, Sara insisted on discipline. Where Eleanor hoped to form a household according to her own ideals, Sara reminded her of the Roosevelt traditions that must be upheld. And yet, it would be too simple to paint Sara solely as domineering or Eleanor solely as oppressed. Their relationship was more intricate, woven of admiration and frustration, dependence and resentment. Eleanor recognized Sara's intelligence, her strength, her devotion to Franklin. She even acknowledged in later years that Sara's guidance had provided stability when she herself felt uncertain. But in the moment, the weight of such guidance was heavy. To live in a house where every choice was measured against another woman's standard was to feel constantly tested, constantly judged. The identical furnishings, arranged with care, became metaphors for the larger truth. This was not entirely Eleanor's home, nor entirely Franklin's. It was an extension of Sara's domain. Franklin, for his part, seemed largely untroubled. He enjoyed the comforts provided, welcomed his mother's visits, and allowed her influence without protest. His easy charm, his buoyant optimism, inclined him to avoid conflict, to believe that harmony could be maintained if he simply refused to acknowledge discord. But harmony was elusive. Beneath the surface courtesies, the tension simmered. Eleanor, though patient, began to cultivate a quiet inner strength, a determination to carve out space for herself, even if that space was small. She read, she reflected, she nurtured her children, and gradually she built an inner life that no furnishings could overshadow. Sara may have arranged the rooms, but Eleanor was arranging her own spirit, preparing for the years when her independence would blossom more fully. The struggle within those walls was not loud or dramatic. It unfolded in small moments: the choice of a meal, the correction of a servant, the comment on a child's behavior. Each moment was a thread, and together they wove a tapestry of subtle conflict. Guests might have seen only the gracious hostess, the attentive mother-in-law, the quiet wife. But behind the polite smiles lay the deeper story of two women negotiating power within a single household. One, the matriarch, determined not to relinquish her authority. The other, the young wife, determined to find her voice. As years passed, the house on East 65th Street became a place of both comfort and strain. Franklin moved easily between his mother and his wife, accepting the gifts of both, yet never fully confronting the tension between them. Sara continued to shape the household. Eleanor continued to seek her own space, and the children grew in an atmosphere of both abundance and quiet conflict. The identical furnishings, polished and enduring, stood unchanged, even as the lives within them shifted and strained. They became silent witnesses to a household where love and rivalry, generosity and control, admiration and resentment coexisted in uneasy balance. The door that had opened upon this house remained open in another sense, for Sara's presence was never confined to its walls. She extended herself into their daily lives, into decisions large and small, ensuring that her hand was always felt. To some, it seemed devotion. To others, domination. But to Sara, it was simply the fulfillment of her role. She had shaped Franklin from cradle to manhood, and she would not step aside now. Marriage, to her mind, did not sever the bond between mother and son. It only expanded the circle of her influence. The image of the open door remains, but beyond it we hear another sound. The laughter of children echoing down the corridors, their small voices calling for mother and grandmother alike. For the next chapter in this story is one of new life, of grandchildren cherished, and of maternal authority extended yet again into another generation. The sound of a child reaching for two hands at once lingers in the air, a tender yet unsettling image. For those small fingers stretched between mother and grandmother spoke more eloquently than words ever could of the quiet contest within the Roosevelt household. The children, born into privilege, innocence, and expectation, found themselves loved by two women whose affections were genuine but whose visions were different. Eleanor, as their mother, longed to nurture independence, resilience, and moral clarity. Sara, as their grandmother, offered devotion as well, but hers was bound to discipline, order, and the perpetuation of family tradition. Between them stood Franklin's sons and daughters, caught in the gentle tug-of-war of love offered in differing forms. Their laughter, their cries, their daily needs became the arena where two philosophies of motherhood played against one another, often without raised voices, but with consequences that echoed throughout their upbringing. Sara adored her grandchildren. To her, they were both continuation and consolation, the living bond that carried forward her love for Franklin and the joy that softened the solitude of her widowhood. She delighted in their presence, guided their manners, and often took the liberty of directing their routines. She insisted that they be properly dressed, properly seated, properly respectful. She spoke to them with warmth but also with firmness, believing that indulgence could weaken character. In her company they felt cherished, but they also felt the steady current of her authority. Eleanor, watching, sometimes admired her mother-in-law's energy, for Sara was indefatigable in her devotion to the children. Yet she also felt undermined, as though her own authority as mother was continually questioned, her choices quietly countermanded, her presence diminished in the very sphere that ought to have been her own. There were moments when Eleanor entered the nursery to find Sara already instructing the children, correcting their posture, or guiding their play. Sometimes gifts appeared, purchased without her knowledge, or outings were arranged without her consent. Eleanor, sensitive and conscientious, found these intrusions painful, yet she often bore them in silence, reluctant to confront Franklin or to risk discord. She internalized her frustrations, turning them inward, questioning herself, even doubting her own adequacy. Yet beneath the silence there stirred a slow determination, a resolve that would one day lead her to carve out her own authority beyond the walls of domestic life. But in these early years, the weight of Sara's presence pressed heavily upon her, and she felt often the shadow of inadequacy in comparison to the commanding figure of her mother-in-law. Franklin, as always, sought harmony. He loved his mother, respected her judgment, and cherished her devotion to his children. At the same time, he loved Eleanor and valued her role as mother of his household. Yet his temperament inclined him to avoid confrontation, to smooth over discord with charm and laughter rather than to resolve it. He encouraged the children to love both women, to accept the dual influence without questioning it. Perhaps he believed that abundance of affection could never be harmful. Perhaps he hoped that time itself would soften the rivalry. Yet by refusing to choose, he allowed the tension to persist, shaping the children's sense of divided authority. The children themselves, too young to articulate the subtleties, nonetheless felt the contrast. With Eleanor, they experienced gentleness, the patience of a mother who sought to understand their fears and hopes. With Sara, they encountered firmness, the presence of a grandmother who demanded discipline but gave security. Some may have preferred one to the other at different moments, but always they reached for both hands, aware that love surrounded them from two directions. Their laughter carried no malice, yet their small gestures revealed the truth of the household, that two visions of motherhood coexisted uneasily under one roof, neither wholly triumphant, neither wholly defeated. The family gatherings bore the mark of this duality. Around the table, Sara presided with stately grace, ensuring that the children behaved with decorum. Eleanor, quieter, guided them gently, seeking to encourage rather than command. Guests, observing, may have noticed only the surface harmony, the well-dressed children, the polished manners, the cheerful conversations. But beneath the veneer, the struggle continued. Eleanor's patience was tested daily, her role challenged at every turn. Sara's devotion, though genuine, often blinded her to the effect of her interventions. She did not see herself as undermining. She saw herself as upholding the standards of family and tradition. To her, Eleanor was inexperienced, uncertain, in need of correction. To Eleanor, Sara was domineering, unyielding, unwilling to step aside. It is tempting to imagine raised voices, arguments, open quarrels. But such scenes were rare. The contest was quieter, woven into the fabric of daily life, expressed in gestures, glances, and small corrections. The sound of a spoon against a cup, the shifting of a chair, the choice of a child's bedtime, these became the instruments of rivalry. The children, innocent, continued to reach for both hands, unaware of the deeper currents. Yet their upbringing was indelibly shaped by this dual influence, instilling in them both a sense of discipline and a hunger for emotional warmth, a mixture that would mark their lives long after childhood ended. For Eleanor, these years were formative. The frustration she felt in her own home forced her to seek purpose elsewhere, to look beyond the nursery and the dining room for her identity. In time, this would lead her into public life, into activism, into the vast arena where her voice would grow stronger than she could have imagined. Yet the seed of that transformation lay in the quiet contest with Sara, in the daily struggle to claim authority within her own household. By resisting, by enduring, by persisting, Eleanor learned the strength that would one day carry her into history. Sara, for her part, never saw herself as an obstacle. She believed she was helping, guiding, preserving. She saw her grandchildren thrive under her influence, saw Franklin succeed, and believed her role essential. She could not imagine stepping back, for to her, devotion meant constancy, and constancy meant control. She loved fiercely, and in that love she could not see the harm of her possessiveness. Her presence remained steady, her authority unshaken, her love unwavering. The image of the child reaching for two hands captures it all: the love, the rivalry, the duality. One hand offered tenderness, the other discipline. One sought to nurture independence, the other to uphold tradition. The child reached for both, not choosing, for in the innocence of youth there is no need to choose. But the image leaves us unsettled, for we know that behind those hands stood two women whose contest was far from resolved. The sound of children's laughter drifts down the corridor, fading into the distance until it mingles with another sound, the scratch of a pen upon paper, signing a campaign leaflet. For beyond the nursery, Franklin's ambitions were beginning to take shape, and with them Sara's influence would stretch from the domestic into the political, guiding her son's first steps into public life. The scratch of a pen upon paper, signing a campaign leaflet, is a sound that seems small, almost trivial, and yet in it lies the opening of a door through which Franklin would step into public life. The pen glides across the page, the ink dries, and what had once been the concerns of a private household now begins to stretch outward into the sphere of politics. Franklin, still young, still forming the contours of his career, leaned upon the confidence he had inherited from his mother, while behind him, unseen by the crowds who would one day cheer his name, stood Sara Delano Roosevelt. She was not content to remain a distant observer of her son's ventures. She became, as she had always been, the architect who steadied his steps and secured his foundations. Sara understood the power of presentation. From the moment Franklin considered public office, she moved to ensure that every detail reflected dignity and stability. She provided funds, as she had always done, ensuring that campaigns were well supplied and appearances respectable. She guided his choice of attire, his bearing, even his words, believing that a Roosevelt must not only speak with conviction, but also embody refinement. To her, politics was not merely about votes, but about image, about the projection of authority. Franklin's easy charm, his buoyant optimism, his gift for connection, these were his own. But the scaffolding of respectability, the assurance that he moved through society as one already marked for leadership, was Sara's gift to him. As Franklin's political life began with his run for the New York State Senate in 1910, Sara's role became both financial and emotional. She supplied not only the money that underwrote his efforts, but also the steady counsel that reminded him of his lineage and his duty. She believed in the power of family legacy, in the idea that a Roosevelt should serve, should lead, should embody responsibility. Franklin, though ambitious in his own right, absorbed this vision. His speeches spoke of reform, of progress, of a new generation ready to lead. But beneath the words lay the imprint of his mother's steady insistence that he was born to stand before others. Eleanor, too, was present in these years, but her role was different. She accompanied Franklin, supported him, learned the rhythms of political life. Yet in these early campaigns, she often remained in the background, overshadowed both by Franklin's charm and by Sarah's commanding presence. Eleanor's independence would come later. For now, she watched as her mother-in-law extended her influence from the nursery to the podium. Sara did not stand upon the platform, but her hand was there in the polished shoes, the confident posture, the very assurance with which Franklin shook hands and met gazes. To the crowds, he was a rising figure. To Sara, he was still her boy, carrying forward the will she had nurtured since his cradle rocked beneath lamplight. Some observers murmured that Franklin was too bound to his mother, that no man could rise freely with such a presence always behind him. They suggested that Sara stifled his independence, that she dictated even his political path. Yet others saw the opposite, that her steady guidance gave him the security to venture boldly, to risk failure knowing that he would never truly fall. For in Sara's world, Franklin could not fail. She would not permit it. She shielded him from discouragement, reinforced his confidence, and reminded him always of his worth. The truth, as always, lies in the balance. Without Sara, Franklin might have faltered. With her, he sometimes risked suffocation. Yet the combination produced a man both confident and cautious, ambitious yet secure, traits that would serve him in the tumultuous years ahead. The campaigns were not grand at first. They were fought in local halls, in town meetings, in conversations with farmers and businessmen. Franklin's voice carried over small crowds before it ever reached a nation. Yet even in these modest beginnings, Sara's influence was felt. She encouraged him to appear dignified, to avoid rash words, to uphold the Roosevelt name with pride. Her presence at Hyde Park remained a constant anchor. When Franklin returned from the campaign trail, weary or uncertain, she was there with counsel and reassurance. He might have faced the public with boldness, but in the quiet of his mother's drawing room, he confessed his doubts. And there she steadied him once more. One may imagine the scene. Sara seated in her chair, Franklin leaning forward, his hands restless, his words spilling out as he recounted the day's challenges. She listens with calm attention, her eyes steady, her manner composed. When he finishes, she speaks, not in flattery but in firmness, reminding him of his strength, his duty, his destiny. He leaves renewed, his doubts diminished, his resolve strengthened. The scratch of the pen on the campaign leaflet echoes still, but behind it is the greater sound of a mother's voice shaping a son's ambition. Eleanor, though often sidelined in these early years, began quietly to learn from the process. She observed the crowds, the speeches, the strategy. She listened to Franklin and to Sara, and within her grew a sense of both frustration and awakening. If her authority at home was limited, perhaps her influence might someday be found elsewhere, in the world beyond the walls of domestic life. The seeds of her later independence were being sown, even as Sara commanded the present. But for now, Eleanor remained a quieter figure, supportive, yet overshadowed, her time not yet come. The world beyond Hyde Park was stirring as well. The early 20th century was an age of reform, of industrial change, of labor unrest and shifting political tides. Franklin, guided by his mother's assurance and his own ambition, stepped eagerly into this world, presenting himself as a new kind of leader. His voice carried across assembly halls, his handshake won him supporters, his charm endeared him to constituents. Yet behind every appearance lay the steady presence of Sara, unseen yet undeniable. She was the architect of his confidence, the guardian of his reputation, the matriarch who ensured that no misstep could undo the legacy she had built. The scratch of the pen, signing a campaign leaflet, may seem small in itself, yet it was the beginning of a journey that would carry Franklin from state politics to national prominence, from local speeches to the White House itself. Sara could not yet know how far that journey would take him, nor could Franklin, but she believed, as she always had, that he was destined for greatness, and she committed herself to guiding him every step of the way. The sound of the pen fades, and in its place comes another, softer, but more haunting, the steady lap of waves against a quiet shore. For soon Franklin's life would be struck by illness, and Sara's vision of protection would be tested in ways she had never imagined, as the sea itself seemed to rise against her son's body. The steady lap of waves against a quiet shore draws us onward, the rhythm of water carrying both serenity and foreboding. It was upon such a shore in the summer of 1921 that Franklin's life was suddenly altered. For at Campobello, the island retreat where sea breezes mingled with the scent of pine, illness came upon him with merciless swiftness. He had spent the day in vigorous play, swimming in cold waters, sailing, delighting in the energy of youth that still coursed through him even as he approached 40. Yet by evening he felt the chill not of the sea, but of something deeper, and by nightfall fever gripped him. Weakness spread through his limbs, and paralysis began its terrible claim. The waves that had once seemed gentle companions now seemed indifferent witnesses, lapping endlessly while Franklin lay in bed, unable to rise. Sara, upon hearing the news, rushed to her son's side. Her presence was immediate, commanding, unyielding. For years she had guarded him, guided him, and insisted upon his strength. Now she confronted the greatest challenge yet to her lifelong vow of protection. To her, Franklin's collapse was not simply illness. It was a threat to the very destiny she had envisioned for him. She moved quickly to shield him from despair, insisting that rest, retreat, and careful care would restore him. Her philosophy was one of protection, of withdrawal from public strain, of preserving his dignity behind closed doors. Eleanor, who was also present, saw matters differently. She believed in engagement, in therapy, in keeping Franklin's spirit alive through activity and responsibility. Thus, in the quiet rooms overlooking the shore, two women once again faced one another, their differing visions now set against the backdrop of Franklin's suffering. The house at Campobello became a place of both silence and whispered argument. Sara urged stillness, blankets, the avoidance of strain. She believed that if Franklin were shielded from exertion, his body would recover in time. Eleanor urged therapy, the presence of friends, the continuation of work to sustain his spirit. Franklin, bedridden and in pain, received both influences, grateful for his mother's devotion, yet also moved by his wife's insistence that he not surrender. Outside, the waves lapped without change, their steady rhythm contrasting with the turbulence inside the house. In the months that followed, as paralysis settled more firmly into his legs, Sara's protective instinct grew even more pronounced. She wished to keep Franklin at Hyde Park, surrounded by familiar comforts, withdrawn from the prying eyes of the public. She imagined him restored to health through rest, returning to a quieter life as a country gentleman, his political ambitions perhaps curtailed, but his dignity preserved. She was ready to adjust the course of his life to fit the limits she believed had now been imposed. To her, the world's gaze was harsh and unforgiving. Better to guard him within the safety of home than to risk humiliation before the public. Eleanor, however, resisted this retreat. She believed Franklin must continue, that his spirit required engagement, that paralysis of the body need not mean paralysis of ambition. She encouraged him to exercise, to resume correspondence, to meet visitors, to remain connected to the political world. The tension between mother and wife reached a new pitch, for each loved him deeply, yet each envisioned a different path. Franklin, in the midst of his trial, felt both the comfort of his mother's constancy and the challenge of his wife's insistence. He was torn, but within this tension he discovered his own resolve. He began to believe, as Eleanor urged, that he could return to public life, even if his body remained impaired. The waves at Campobello had whispered inevitability, yet Franklin refused to accept it. The strength he displayed in the years after his illness was not born of ease but of struggle. Struggle between his mother's protection and his wife's urging. Sara, though skeptical of Eleanor's insistence on rehabilitation, did not abandon her son when he chose differently. She continued to support him financially, emotionally, socially. She may not have agreed with his determination to re-enter politics, but she did not withhold her resources. Her devotion was unshaken, even when her vision was not followed. She remained the guardian at Hyde Park, ensuring that when Franklin returned there between efforts, he found comfort, dignity, and the unyielding love of his mother. The illness transformed Franklin, but it also deepened the lines of conflict within the family. Eleanor grew stronger, discovering a purpose in aiding her husband's recovery and in stepping into roles he could not fulfill during his convalescence. She became more independent, more confident, more engaged with the world beyond. Sara, while remaining central, began to sense the limits of her influence. She could no longer dictate Franklin's every path, for his own resolve and Eleanor's partnership now pressed forward. Yet even so, she remained a figure of immense weight, her presence shaping the atmosphere of every decision. The waves at Campobello faded into memory, but their echo remained in the household, a reminder of the moment when Franklin's life turned, and with it the balance of power among those closest to him. It is worth pausing to reflect upon the nature of maternal love in such circumstances. Was Sara wrong to wish for retreat, to shield her son from the harsh gaze of the world? Or was her instinct simply the natural expression of a mother's heart, unwilling to expose her beloved to further pain? And was Eleanor right to insist on engagement, to push Franklin into the public eye despite his frailty? Or did she risk demanding too much from a body already broken? These questions do not yield easy answers, for both women acted from love, yet their love pointed in opposite directions. Perhaps it was the tension between them that gave Franklin the strength to choose his own way, to balance protection with ambition, rest with action. The waves at Campobello eventually gave way to the quieter rhythms of Hyde Park, where Franklin continued his slow recovery. Sara presided as always, arranging comforts, ensuring dignity, shielding him from prying eyes. Yet the world beyond could not be kept at bay. Visitors came, letters arrived, politics beckoned. Franklin, aided by Eleanor, began to re-enter the current. Sara watched, anxious yet proud, fearful yet supportive. She may have wished for retreat, but she could not deny her son's determination. Her role, as it had always been, was to stand behind him, to steady him, to provide the foundation from which he might rise again. The sound of waves lapping against the shore fades, replaced now by another sound, the soft but unmistakable image of two women standing apart in one room, their silence filled with years of rivalry and necessity. For as Franklin returned to politics, the relationship between Sara and Eleanor entered a new phase, marked not only by conflict, but by the recognition that neither could wholly displace the other. The image of two women standing apart in one room lingers, their silence filling the air more heavily than any quarrel might have done. They were bound together by the same man, yet separated by their different claims upon him. On one side stood Sara, tall and dignified, the matriarch of Hyde Park, her life long devoted to shaping and shielding her only son. On the other side stood Eleanor, quiet but increasingly firm, a woman who had grown from shy uncertainty into a figure discovering her own strength through the trials of marriage and illness. They did not shout, for that was not their way. Their rivalry was enacted through posture, through silence, through the subtle turns of words spoken at the dinner table or in the nursery. Yet in that silent room, one sensed that each was aware of the other as a presence that could neither be ignored nor removed. Franklin's illness had altered more than his body. It had changed the balance within his household. Sarah's protective instinct had been tested, and though she continued to guard and provide, she could not deny the growing importance of Eleanor's role. It was Eleanor who had pushed him toward rehabilitation, who had organized his schedule, who had supported his correspondence and political re-engagement. Sara remained the guardian of comfort, but Eleanor had become the guardian of progress. Neither role could be dismissed, and so the two women stood apart, each knowing that the other was necessary, each unwilling to yield her claim. The room itself seemed to bear witness to their tension. The furnishings, often chosen by Sara, spoke of tradition, continuity, control. Yet upon the writing desk lay letters addressed in Eleanor's hand, invitations, schedules, causes that hinted at her widening sphere. Sara looked upon these with skepticism, believing that politics was her son's world, not his wife's. Eleanor looked upon the furnishings with quiet resentment, sensing that even in her own home she lived in rooms arranged by another's taste. The children moved between them, affectionate toward both, but aware, even in youth, of the current of rivalry that filled the air. Franklin, ever the mediator, sought to soothe rather than resolve. He loved both women, relied upon both, and perhaps believed that by refusing to confront their conflict, he could preserve peace. He smiled, he charmed, he reassured. Yet beneath his surface optimism lay the truth that their rivalry shaped his household, influenced his marriage, and left its mark upon his children. He could not choose between them, and so he allowed the balance to remain uneasy, the room always filled with a tension that never quite dissolved. For Sara, Eleanor's growing independence was both unsettling and incomprehensible. She had been raised in a world where a woman's authority lay within her household, where her role was to support, not to lead. To see her daughter-in-law engaging with politics, speaking publicly, carving her own identity beyond the nursery, seemed both unfeminine and unnecessary. Sara believed that Eleanor's strength should be turned inward, toward family, toward supporting Franklin. That Eleanor should seek her own causes, her own voice, struck her as a deviation from the order she valued. She respected Eleanor's devotion but questioned her ambition. Eleanor, on the other hand, felt suffocated by Sara's constant presence. She admired her intelligence, her discipline, her devotion, but she resented her control. She longed for space to define herself, for freedom to act without judgment. In the shadow of her mother-in-law, she often felt diminished, treated as inexperienced, even childish. Yet the very struggle with Sara forced Eleanor to grow. Each time she asserted herself, each time she endured correction without bending, each time she sought purpose beyond Hyde Park, she strengthened her own resolve. In the long silence of their rivalry, Eleanor found her voice. The two women rarely clashed openly. Instead, their conflict was woven into daily life. A suggestion from Sara countered by a quiet refusal from Eleanor. A correction offered, a silence returned. A decision made by Eleanor, later adjusted by Sara. These were the patterns that shaped their years together, a dance of opposition performed without overt declaration. To outsiders, the household might have appeared harmonious, even enviable. But those within knew the truth, that every day was marked by the delicate balance of two wills unwilling to yield. Yet despite the tension, there were moments of unexpected alliance. When Franklin's health faltered, both women stood by his side. When the children faced illness or difficulty, both offered comfort. When the family was threatened by gossip or scandal, both worked to preserve dignity. Their rivalry did not erase their shared devotion to Franklin and his children. In moments of crisis, their opposition gave way to a united front, as if the very tension between them created a strength that neither alone could provide. They were, in a strange way, bound together not only by love of the same man, but by the necessity of each other's presence. It is worth reflecting upon the paradox of their relationship. They stood apart in silence, each resenting the other, each questioning the other's role. Yet together they formed the twin pillars that supported Franklin's life. Without Sarah's devotion, his confidence might have faltered. Without Eleanor's encouragement, his ambition might have withered. Together they created the balance that sustained him, even if that balance was uneasy. The silent room where they stood apart was also the room that kept him steady. As years passed, the rivalry softened at times, hardened at others, but it never disappeared. Sara remained the matriarch, dignified and commanding, her presence a constant reminder of tradition and authority. Eleanor grew into her own, carving a life of independence, eventually stepping beyond the household into the wider world of politics and activism. Yet even then, Sarah's shadow remained. The room where they had once stood apart continued to echo with their presence, long after the moment itself had passed. The image of two women standing apart fades, but in its place we hear another sound, the tap of a cane against stone, steady, deliberate, echoing through a courtyard. For Franklin, having chosen to continue in politics despite his illness, now moved forward with the aid of crutches and braces, his determination unbroken. And as he tapped his way across the stones, both his mother and his wife watched, each seeing in his steps the reflection of her own influence. The tap of a cane against stone carries forward, each strike ringing clear and deliberate, the rhythm of a man who refuses surrender. Franklin, once vigorous upon sea and field, now moved with braces upon his legs and the assistance of canes, yet his spirit did not falter. Each step across the courtyard was an act of defiance, a statement to the world and perhaps to himself that he would not be confined by paralysis. Behind the echo of that cane, one might hear the blended voices of two women, Sara urging caution, Eleanor urging persistence. He carried both within him, and with each tap he announced his decision to continue, not as the man he had been, but as the man he had become. Sara, observing his struggle, felt both pride and anxiety. She admired his determination, for she had raised him to face life with confidence, but she also feared the toll it would take upon him. Her instinct was always to protect, to preserve, to withdraw him from the harsh gaze of the public. Yet she could not deny his will, nor could she ignore the new strength Eleanor had given him. Thus she lent her support in the way she knew best, by providing resources, by ensuring that the household remained stable, by guarding his dignity at every turn. She may have doubted the wisdom of his return to politics, but she did not waver in her devotion. If Franklin was to walk with canes into public life, then she would see to it that he did so with the bearing of a Roosevelt. Eleanor, standing beside him, urged him onward. She saw in his determination not only resilience but opportunity, the chance to prove to himself and to others that his spirit was unbroken. She encouraged his practice, his exercises, his correspondence, his re-entry into the political world. To her, the tapping of the cane was not merely defiance, it was a call to action, a reminder that life's value lay in engagement, not withdrawal. She admired his courage, and in supporting him she discovered her own. For in helping Franklin reclaim his life, she was also claiming her own independence, moving beyond the shadow of Sara and into her own authority. The courtyard where Franklin practiced his steps became a stage of sorts, the scene of a quiet drama that would shape the years ahead. Servants watched from a distance, noting his determination. Visitors came, sometimes surprised to see him upright, moving with effort, yet with dignity. Each tap of the cane spoke more than words could convey. It told of suffering endured, of resolve tested, of a will unbroken. It carried the weight of Sara's lifelong training, her insistence on poise and confidence. It carried the urgency of Eleanor's encouragement, her belief in the necessity of engagement. Franklin, in that moment, was the embodiment of both women's influence, and in his steps one could hear the mingling of their rival visions. As he re-entered public life, Sara's support remained constant. She provided the funds that sustained his ventures, the home that anchored him, the dignity that shielded him from ridicule. She wrote letters, advised him on appearances, reminded him of his responsibility to the family name. Her influence was quieter now, less visible to the public, but it remained essential. Behind every speech, every journey, every campaign, Sara's presence could be felt, unseen but unwavering. To Franklin, her approval still mattered deeply, even when he chose a path different from the one she advised. Eleanor, meanwhile, grew more visible. She accompanied Franklin, represented him when he could not appear, engaged with supporters, and built her own network of contacts. Her confidence increased, her voice strengthened, her presence expanded. The woman who had once seemed shy and uncertain now stood before groups, spoke with conviction, and began to shape her own place in the world. Franklin, grateful for her support, encouraged her involvement, and together they presented a partnership that inspired admiration. Yet even in this new balance, Sara remained. She might no longer command the forefront, but her shadow stretched across every endeavor. It is striking to consider how the tap of a cane against stone, a sound born of infirmity, became instead a symbol of strength. Franklin's disability, which might have ended another man's career, became the crucible that refined his character. In it, we see the imprint of Sara's discipline, the firmness she instilled from childhood, the insistence on bearing and dignity. In it, we see the influence of Eleanor, the urging to persevere, to engage, to press forward. The cane was not merely a support for his body, it was the outward expression of the inner strength forged by two women who, though divided, had together shaped him. The world, observing Franklin's return, responded with a mixture of sympathy and admiration. Some doubted his ability to continue, yet many were moved by his resilience. The sight of him, upright despite paralysis, inspired confidence. It suggested not weakness but determination, not defeat but triumph. His speeches, delivered with warmth and conviction, carried even greater weight when contrasted with the visible struggle of his body. People saw in him not only a politician, but a man who had endured suffering and risen above it. And behind that perception, behind the courage that shone in his smile, lay the steady, often unseen influence of Sara Delano Roosevelt. As Franklin's public life grew, Sara's private role deepened. She remained the keeper of Hyde Park, the anchor to which he returned, the guardian of his dignity. She was proud, yet she also worried, always fearing that his exertions would exhaust him, that the world would prove too cruel. Yet she never withdrew her support. She financed, she advised, she encouraged, even when her counsel differed from Eleanor's. Her devotion never wavered, even as her authority was sometimes challenged. She remained what she had always been, the matriarch, the unseen foundation of her son's life. The tap of the cane against stone fades slowly, its rhythm echoing into memory. In its place comes another sound, softer yet powerful, the voice of a radio carrying words across distance, echoing through a quiet room. For soon Franklin would ascend beyond local politics, beyond recovery, beyond private struggle, to the stage of national leadership. And Sara, seated in Hyde Park, would listen as her son's voice carried across the nation, proud yet thoughtful, aware that the destiny she had long guarded was now unfolding before all the world. The voice of a radio echoing in a quiet room drifts softly through the air, tinny yet commanding, carrying words spoken far away, but heard as if within the very walls of Hyde Park. It is Franklin's voice, resonant and assured, reaching across the static to a nation unsettled by hardship. Sara sits listening, her posture upright, her eyes steady, her heart both proud and contemplative. She had always known he would rise, though perhaps even she could not have foreseen the weight of the mantle he now bore. The year was 1932, and Franklin Delano Roosevelt had been chosen to lead a troubled country. His inauguration, his speeches, his presence upon the stage of history, these were moments that seemed both fulfillment and transformation, the culmination of decades of her watchful guardianship. The radio, that new instrument of connection, became the thread by which her son's voice reached millions. And yet within the quiet of Hyde Park, it sounded as though he spoke only to her. For Sara, the moment carried more than pride. It was also the realization that the boy she had once rocked in a cradle, the youth she had guided through Groton and Harvard, the young man whose marriage she had overseen and whose illness she had guarded, now belonged to the world. He was no longer hers alone, no longer the child of Hyde Park. He was the President of the United States, bound to a people whose needs stretched far beyond the reach of a mother's hand. She accepted this truth with dignity, yet within her there must have stirred the quiet ache of letting go, a task she had resisted for so many years. Still, she did not step back entirely. Even as Franklin stood before the world, she remained his mother, his counselor, his critic, his anchor. The election of 1932 had been no small affair. The nation, gripped by the Great Depression, looked for hope where little seemed to be found. Banks had failed, bread lines stretched long, and confidence lay shattered. Franklin's campaign promised a New Deal, words that carried both vagueness and possibility. Yet more than policies, it was his presence, his voice, his optimism that inspired faith. To the crowds, he was a leader reborn from personal struggle, a man who had faced paralysis, yet smiled, who could lift a nation with the same resilience he had shown in his own life. To Sara, he was still her son, carrying forward the discipline, the dignity, the confidence she had instilled. She recognized in his smile the boy she had nurtured, in his bearing the lessons she had taught, in his calm assurance the imprint of her will. The night he was elected, celebrations echoed across cities and towns. Crowds filled the streets, cheering, waving flags, shouting his name. But at Hyde Park, the atmosphere was different, more intimate, more contemplative. Sara sat quietly, absorbing the magnitude of the moment. Franklin had risen as she had always believed he would, yet the reality carried a weight beyond imagining. She must have asked herself, in the stillness of that evening, whether she had prepared him enough, whether her lifelong guardianship had given him the strength required for such a task. For to shape a household is one thing, to shape a nation is another. And though she could not answer, she trusted in the foundation she had laid. In the months that followed, the White House became Franklin and Eleanor's domain, yet Sara remained a frequent presence. She visited often, her influence still felt, her counsel still offered. She observed with pride as Franklin spoke to the nation through his fireside chats, his voice filling living rooms across America just as it filled hers at Hyde Park. She admired his calm confidence, his ability to soothe fear with words, to inspire hope through tone alone. Yet she also noted, perhaps with quiet satisfaction, that his dignity, his bearing, his assurance were all qualities she had long instilled. The world might see a great leader, but Sara saw her son, the boy she had raised, now fulfilling the destiny she had guarded since his birth. The radio, that strange device of voices carried on unseen waves, became a kind of mirror for Sara. Each time she listened, she was reminded of the distance between them, yet also of the bond that no distance could sever. When Franklin spoke of courage, she remembered the lessons she had pressed into him as a child. When he spoke of resilience, she thought of Campobello, of the long months of struggle and her constant presence. When he spoke of faith, she thought of her own unyielding will, the conviction that had carried both of them through sorrow and trial. His words to the nation were, in a way, echoes of her words to him. The radio transmitted not only Franklin's voice, but also, faintly, the presence of Sara Delano Roosevelt, Yet pride was not the only emotion she felt. With pride came anxiety, the maternal worry that never leaves. She feared for his health, for the burdens he carried, for the relentless demands of leadership. She feared the strain upon his body, already tested by illness. She feared the cruelty of politics, the bitterness of opponents, the possibility of failure. To the nation, Franklin appeared strong, unshakable, but to Sara he was still her child, vulnerable beneath the mantle of power. She listened not only with admiration but with concern, hearing in every word the weight of responsibility he bore. Eleanor's role grew more visible in these years, and Sara could not ignore it. Eleanor became the first lady not of drawing rooms, but of the nation, traveling, speaking, advocating. She stood beside Franklin, yet also apart, carving her own sphere of influence. Sara regarded her with a mixture of admiration and unease. She respected Eleanor's devotion but questioned her public presence. In Sara's world, such visibility was unseemly, yet she could not deny its effectiveness. She may have stood apart from Eleanor in vision, yet she recognized that her daughter-in-law had become indispensable to Franklin's work. The rivalry remained, but necessity bound them. The voice of the radio in the quiet room thus carried not only the sound of Franklin's words, but the echoes of all that had shaped him. The discipline of Sara, the encouragement of Eleanor, the resilience of his own will. It carried the memory of Hyde Park, the cradle beneath lamplight, the cane tapping against stone. It carried the presence of a mother who had never relinquished her claim, even as her son became a figure of history. The radio voice fades slowly, lingering like the last notes of music, leaving behind the image of a curtain rustling softly in a White House room. For behind those curtains, unseen by the public, Sara sometimes sat, her presence discreet yet undeniable, watching her son in the fullness of his power, still the mother who had never let go. The faint rustle of a curtain behind which one watches leads us into another chapter, for though the world now looked upon Franklin as president, Sara remained present in ways subtle yet undeniable. The White House, with its tall windows and marble halls, was a stage upon which the life of a nation unfolded, and yet behind the curtain stood the same maternal figure who had always observed, always guarded, always counseled. She did not seek the limelight. She had never craved public acclaim, but she insisted upon closeness, upon presence, upon the right to watch, to advise, to correct when she deemed it necessary. Her son's triumphs were hers, and his burdens, too, she felt as her own. To those who served and visited, she was Franklin's mother, dignified and venerable. To Franklin himself, she was still the axis of his private life, the one before whom he could not quite escape being the boy she had raised. When Sara entered the White House, she did so as though she belonged, and in truth, she believed she did. After all, what was the presidency but another extension of her son's destiny, and therefore of her guardianship? She took her place in its rooms as naturally as she had in Hyde Park, her presence commanding deference from staff, who quickly learned that this was no ordinary guest. She offered opinions on household arrangements, critiqued the furnishings, and often commented upon the manner of receptions. Eleanor, already straining beneath the weight of her role as First Lady, felt again the familiar shadow of her mother-in-law. For Sara, though aged, had lost none of her will. She believed that the White House should reflect dignity and continuity, not experimentation or novelty, and she did not hesitate to make her views known. Franklin, as ever, mediated with charm. He welcomed his mother, listened to her counsel, and sought to ease the tension between her and Eleanor. To him, Sara's presence was reassuring, a reminder of stability amidst the storms of politics and the demands of leadership. Yet even he must have felt at times the quiet strain of two women shaping the atmosphere of his household. Eleanor envisioned the White House as a platform for social reform, for advocacy, for opening its doors to voices rarely heard. Sara saw it as a bastion of tradition, to be preserved, guarded, and upheld. Their visions clash not always openly but in undercurrents, in subtle disagreements, in the constant negotiation of space and authority. Visitors noticed her. They remarked upon her dignity, her composure, her commanding presence. She was respected as the president's mother, admired for her devotion, yet also whispered about as perhaps too influential, too present, too unyielding. Some saw her as the quiet power behind Franklin, the hidden hand that had shaped him and still guided him. Others regarded her as an intruder into the First Lady's sphere, a figure who could not relinquish control even as her son governed a nation. Yet Sara herself never saw her presence as intrusive. To her, it was natural, even necessary. She had always stood beside Franklin, and she would continue to do so, curtain or no curtain, White House or Hyde Park. She listened closely to his speeches, often commenting upon them afterward. She noted his tone, his gestures, his choice of words. She praised when she approved, critiqued when she did not, always with the authority of one who had shaped him from the cradle. Franklin, for his part, accepted her counsel with patience. He valued her approval, even when he did not follow her advice. He understood that her criticism was born of love, that her guidance was the continuation of a lifetime's devotion. Yet he also knew that he was no longer the boy at Hyde Park, no longer the young man at Harvard. He was the President of the United States, and in this role he sometimes chose differently. Sara accepted this with dignity, but within her heart she must have felt the sting of distance, the slow recognition that her influence, though still strong, was no longer absolute. The rustle of the curtain captures the essence of her role in these years. She watched, she advised, she commented, but she was not the one upon the stage. She remained just behind, unseen yet present, her voice still carried into Franklin's ear though the world did not hear it. It was a role both satisfying and bittersweet. She saw her son at the height of his power, fulfilling the destiny she had long believed was his. Yet she also saw him surrounded by advisors, by politicians, by Eleanor, by a world of influences beyond her reach. She had shaped him, but now others shaped him as well. The curtain separated not only public from private, but mother from son, devotion from destiny. In her visits to the White House, Sara often walked the halls with a mixture of pride and possession. She admired its grandeur, its history, but she also measured it against her own sense of propriety. She corrected what she found wanting, suggested improvements, and sometimes gently scolded Eleanor for choices she deemed ill-suited. Eleanor endured as she always had, with a combination of patience and quiet resistance. She had grown strong enough now to assert herself more openly, to defend her choices, to hold her ground. The tension remained, yet it was tempered by necessity. Both women recognized that Franklin required them, each in her own way, and so the rivalry continued, no longer fierce as in earlier years, but enduring, an undercurrent beneath the surface of the White House's polished receptions and formal dinners. It is easy, from the vantage of history, to judge. Some would say Sara was overbearing, unable to release her hold. Others would argue that her presence gave Franklin the grounding he needed, the assurance that he was never alone. Perhaps both are true. Maternal love, especially when concentrated upon a single child, is never simple. It binds, it shapes, it protects, but it also constrains. Sara's love for Franklin was fierce, unyielding, and lifelong. Whether it nurtured or suffocated, or both at once, depends upon where one stands behind the curtain. The years in the White House passed, marked by crisis and triumph. Franklin guided the nation through depression, through reform, through storms that tested every institution. Sara remained his steady admirer, his constant critic, his mother still. Yet age was advancing, and even as she watched proudly, she must have felt the slow approach of her own decline. The curtain through which she peered was no longer as opaque. It seemed thinner, as though time itself whispered that the days of influence would soon yield to silence. The rustle of the curtain fades, and in its place comes the image of a letter left unopened upon a desk. For in the delicate balance of family life, communication was not always simple, and sometimes words, though written, were never read, lying in silence between mother and daughter-in-law, between authority and independence. The image of the unopened letter on a desk remains, its envelope gathering dust, its message suspended in silence. Perhaps it was a letter between Eleanor and Sara, words written but never received, thoughts pressed to paper but left unread. Such a letter symbolizes the relationship between these two women, communication attempted yet often incomplete, words spoken yet rarely heard in the way they were intended. Their bond was never absent. Too much tied them together for that, but it was never easy either. They were two figures standing in constant relation, sometimes parallel, sometimes opposed, bound by their love for Franklin and by the family they shared, yet divided by temperament, vision, and authority. Eleanor had grown by this time into more than a wife. She was now a public figure in her own right, her voice reaching beyond the walls of the White House into the wider world. She advocated for social reform, spoke for those unheard, and championed causes that carried her far from the domestic sphere where Sara had once tried to confine her. For many across the nation, Eleanor became a symbol of conscience, an active first lady unlike any before her. Yet for Sara, this transformation was difficult to accept. She respected Eleanor's devotion to Franklin and her tireless energy, but she remained skeptical of a woman who sought influence so publicly. To her, Eleanor's independence seemed both unnecessary and unbecoming, a departure from the traditions of wifehood and motherhood that Sara held sacred. The unopened letter captures this dissonance. Eleanor may have written with sincerity, explaining her commitments, her hopes, her decisions, but Sara, even if she read such words, might not have fully received them. To Sara, duty meant devotion to family, to household, to the preservation of dignity. To Eleanor, duty meant engagement with the world, a responsibility to those beyond her family. The two women spoke the same word, duty, but they meant different things, and so their letters, whether literal or metaphorical, often remained unopened, their meanings never reconciled. Franklin stood between them, as he always had, smoothing, mediating, refusing to choose. He understood his mother's love, valued her counsel, and relied upon her financial and emotional support. He also recognized Eleanor's strength, her partnership, her ability to complement his leadership with her own vision. He did not ask them to love one another, but he needed them both, and so he maintained the balance, even when the strain was heavy. To him, the unopened letters were not failures but necessities. Better silence than confrontation, better distance than open conflict. His optimism, his belief in harmony, led him to hope that time alone would ease the divide. Yet time did not heal their differences. The rivalry endured, softened by age but never erased. Sara continued to advise, to correct, to guard, her presence in Franklin's life unbroken. Eleanor continued to expand, to assert, to engage, her presence in the nation growing ever larger. They intersected often, sometimes with civility, sometimes with quiet resistance, but rarely with warmth. And yet, beneath the tension, there lay a recognition, however unspoken, that each was indispensable. Sara may have disapproved of Eleanor's public life, but she could not deny her usefulness to Franklin. Eleanor may have resented Sara's authority, but she could not deny her devotion to Franklin. Each, in her own way, sustained him, and in that shared purpose, they found a tenuous form of alliance. The unopened letter upon the desk thus symbolizes not only silence, but also endurance. It reminds us that relationships need not resolve to persist. Sara and Eleanor never reconciled in the way one might hope, but they endured side by side, each fulfilling a role the other could not, each sustaining Franklin in ways the other would not. Their bond was not affectionate, but it was necessary, and necessity bound them more tightly than affection ever could. Within the White House, the tension played out in subtle gestures. Sarah's visits, dignified and commanding, reminded Eleanor of her enduring authority. Eleanor's public speeches, earnest and reformist, reminded Sara of her independence. They exchanged courtesies, shared meals, sometimes even laughed together. Yet beneath the surface, the unopened letters remained, words unsaid, meanings unacknowledged. History records no reconciliation, no moment of embrace. Yet history also records no complete rupture, no final severing. They lived in opposition, yet in parallel, like two lines that never meet, yet always remain in relation. For Franklin, this balance was enough. He did not need them to love each other. He needed them both to love him. And this they did, each fiercely, each unyieldingly, each in her own way. Sarah's love was protective, guarding his dignity, preserving his image, ensuring his stability. Eleanor's love was challenging, pushing him forward, urging him into action, reminding him of responsibility beyond himself. He stood between them, receiving from both, shaped by both, sustained by both. The unopened letters upon the desk did not trouble him as they trouble us, for he had long accepted that silence and tension were the price of his mother's devotion and his wife's independence. As the years passed, age began to weigh upon Sara. She remained dignified, composed, commanding, but her strength slowly diminished. She watched Franklin guide the nation through storms greater than any she had imagined, the Depression, the gathering shadows of war, and she remained proud, though anxious. She listened to his speeches on the radio, her heart swelling with recognition of the boy she had raised, now the man who led millions. She continued to offer counsel, though perhaps less insistently, her authority tempered by age. Yet her presence remained, the unopened letters upon the desk still reminding all who saw them that some bonds are never resolved, only endured. The image of the letter lingers, but it is soon overshadowed by another, the slow tolling of a clock striking midnight. For Sarah's years were drawing to a close, and the house at Hyde Park, long under her command, would soon pass into silence without her. The slow tolling of a clock striking midnight fills the darkened halls of Hyde Park, each resonant chime spreading through rooms that had long known her presence. The sound is steady, measured, inevitable, and it seems to echo the passing of Sara Delano Roosevelt's later years. Midnight is both an end and a beginning, the close of one day, the birth of another. So it was with Sara, whose authority remained even as age pressed upon her. She was still the matriarch, the mistress of Hyde Park, her presence as commanding as ever. But the shadows of time lengthened, and she began to move more slowly, to rest more often, to reflect more deeply on the long journey that had brought her to this moment. The house itself seemed bound to her still. Servants lowered their voices when she entered. Visitors deferred to her as they always had, and Franklin, even as president, spoke to her with the respect of a son whose mother's word remained heavy with meaning. Yet beneath the dignity of her command lay the quiet reminder that time spares no one. She felt it in her bones, in the weight of her steps, in the stillness of evenings when the clock's chime sounded louder than it once had. Her authority had not faded, but it had softened, tempered by the humility that age eventually brings even to the strongest of wills. She looked upon Hyde Park with both pride and melancholy. The gardens, the orchards, the rooms she had ordered so meticulously still reflected her touch, yet she knew she could not hold them forever. The portraits on the walls, the furniture polished by generations, the very air of continuity, all were part of the legacy she had guarded, but they now seemed to whisper of impermanence. She had spent her life preserving, controlling, shaping, and yet midnight's chime reminded her that she too was part of the order of time, that her command would one day pass into memory. Still, she did not relinquish easily. To her last years, she remained vigilant, still correcting, still guiding, still reminding her son and grandchildren of the dignity that must be preserved. Franklin continued to visit, though now his responsibilities stretched across oceans and continents. He came to Hyde Park when he could, finding in its rooms the stability that his public life often lacked. To him, Sara was still the foundation, the presence that anchored him. He wrote to her, confided in her, and even in his maturity sought her approval. The president of a nation was still in his heart the boy of Hyde Park, and Sara remained the one before whom he could never fully shed that role. Their bond endured, unbroken, as constant as the midnight chime of the clock in the hall. Eleanor, too, continued in her own path, her independence now fully formed, her public role established. The rivalry between mother and daughter-in-law remained, softened at times by necessity, sharpened at others by difference. Sara, in her later years, no longer possessed the energy to contest every choice, but she never ceased to hold opinions, never refrained from comment. Eleanor endured with patience, recognizing that Sara's authority, though tempered, remained. The unopened letters of their relationship were never truly read, but they continued to lie between them, symbols of a bond both unyielding and unresolved. Midnight, with its mixture of silence and inevitability, brought Sara often to reflection. She thought of her own childhood, of her father's voyages to China, of the wealth that had risen and fallen and risen again. She thought of her marriage to James Roosevelt, so unequal in age, yet steady in dignity. She thought of Franklin's birth, the cradle beneath lamplight, the years of guardianship that had defined her life. She thought of her widowhood, of Hyde Park under her sole command, of the decades spent shaping her son's destiny. Each memory passed before her like the slow toll of the clock, measured, inevitable, carrying both pride and sorrow. And always she returned to Franklin. He was her life's work, her legacy, her justification. She had shaped him, guided him, guarded him, and now he stood as president, leading a nation through crises she could scarcely have imagined. She listened to his voice on the radio, read of his speeches in the newspapers, and knew that her influence lived on in him. She may not have walked the stage of history, but she had placed him upon it. Midnight's chime reminded her that her own time was waning, but it also reminded her that his time was now. Her grandchildren, grown into young adults, visited and paid her respects. She loved them deeply, though her manner remained commanding. She offered advice, sometimes stern, sometimes gentle, reminding them always of the dignity of their name. They respected her, perhaps even feared her a little, but they also cherished her presence. To them, she was not only grandmother, but matriarch, the living embodiment of continuity. In her later years, she became to them what she had always been to Franklin, the axis around which the family revolved. The midnight chime grew heavier with each passing year. Sara felt the approach of decline, though she did not speak of it often. She carried herself with dignity to the end, refusing to surrender authority, even as her body grew frail. The house still seemed to wait for her footsteps. The servants still looked for her direction. Franklin still valued her counsel. But within herself, she knew that time was nearing its close, that the midnight of her life would soon be struck. She prepared not with fear, but with acceptance, trusting that the legacy she had built would endure, that the son she had raised would carry her influence forward, even after her own voice was silent. The slow tolling of midnight fades into silence, leaving only the dim glow of a candle guttering low, its flame flickering against the dark. For soon the moment would come when Sara's long watch ended, when her presence, so commanding for so many years, would give way to silence, and the rooms of Hyde Park would stand without her. The candle guttering low casts its wavering light across the quiet chamber, shadows rising and falling upon the familiar walls of Hyde Park. It is here, within the home she had ruled for decades, that Sara Delano Roosevelt approached her final illness. The flame, flickering uncertainly, yet still refusing to die, seemed to mirror her own spirit. Frail in body, but unwilling to surrender the authority that had defined her life. She reclined with dignity, her posture straight, even in weakness, her eyes clear though her strength ebbed. Around her moved the hushed attentions of servants and the worried glances of family, yet all deferred to her still, for Sarah's presence, even at the edge of life, commanded respect. Franklin came as often as he could, though the burdens of office weighed heavily upon him. He entered the chamber not as president, but as son, his expression softening in her presence, his voice lowered to the gentler tones of childhood. He sat beside her, holding her hand, listening as she spoke in measured words. Even in her weakness, she offered counsel, reminding him of dignity, of perseverance, of the responsibilities he bore. He smiled, he nodded, he soothed, but he also listened. For to him, her words carried weight until the end. She had been the anchor of his life, and now, as her candle guttered low, he felt the approach of a silence that would leave him unmoored. Eleanor, too, was present, her demeanor composed, her respect for Sara evident despite the years of tension between them. She moved with quiet efficiency, ensuring comfort, arranging care, maintaining the dignity of the household. She did not intrude upon Franklin's moments with his mother, but she stood nearby, aware that she was witnessing the closing of a chapter that had shaped her own life as much as Franklin's. She knew that in Sara's passing, there would be both release and loss, both relief from rivalry and grief at the disappearance of a figure who had loomed so large. Even she, who had so often felt diminished in Sara's presence, could not deny the formidable strength of the woman whose influence had defined their family. The candle sputtered as Sara's illness advanced. She spoke less, rested more, yet her gaze remained steady, her will unbroken. She looked upon her grandchildren with affection, reminding them softly of their name, their duty, their place within the long line of Roosevelts. She offered blessings, advice, and sometimes corrections, even from her bed. To the very end, she remained the matriarch, her authority intact, her devotion fierce. She did not rage against death. She accepted it with the same composure with which she had accepted every trial of life. Yet she did not surrender easily either. Each day she lingered seemed an act of will, as though she refused to release her hold until she was certain that Franklin and the family she had guarded so long were ready to continue without her. Franklin, seated beside her, must have felt the ache of inevitability. He had faced crises of nation and body with courage, but the prospect of losing his mother was different. For all his stature, he remained her child in that room, the boy who had once run across Hyde Park lawns, the young man she had guided into marriage, the son she had nursed through illness. He held her hand as though by doing so he could hold back the tide of time. Yet the candle flickered still, and he knew that soon the light would go out. In those last days, Sara's thoughts turned often to the past. She spoke of her childhood in the Delano family, of voyages and wealth, of the quiet strength of her parents. She recalled her marriage to James Roosevelt, her years as wife and then widow, her stewardship of Hyde Park. She spoke of Franklin's birth, of his youth, of the pride she felt as he grew into the man she had always believed he would become. Her words were not dramatic. They were measured, contemplative, like the toll of a distant bell. She looked back not with regret but with calm pride, certain that she had fulfilled her role. The candle burned lower, its wax pooling, its flame shrinking. Around the bed, silence deepened, broken only by the soft rustle of fabric, the shifting of a chair, the faint catch of Franklin's breath. Eleanor stood with quiet dignity, the grandchildren nearby, the servants discreet in their movements. All knew that they were witnessing the end of an era, the departure of a figure whose authority had shaped not only a household but a president, and through him, a nation. At last the flame trembled, flared, and grew still. Sara Delano Roosevelt passed from life as she had lived within it, dignified, composed, commanding. The room fell silent, the shadows deepened, and the house of Hyde Park, for the first time in decades, stood without its matriarch. Franklin bowed his head, grief etched upon his face, knowing that though he had lost his mother, he would never lose the imprint of her influence. Eleanor, quiet and steady, stepped forward to comfort him, aware that in Sara's passing lay not only sorrow but also a shift in the balance of their own lives. The candle had gone out, but its light remained in the hearts of those she had shaped. The guttering candle fades into darkness, leaving only the image of morning light breaking slowly over Hyde Park, illuminating the house now under new stewardship, where Franklin and Eleanor must continue without the watchful presence that had so long guided them. The image of morning light breaking slowly over Hyde Park lingers, pale rays filtering through branches heavy with dew, casting long shadows across the lawns that had so often echoed with Sara's measured steps. The house stood unchanged in its structure, yet within its rooms there was a quietness unlike any that had been known before. For the first time in decades, no matriarch's voice rose to direct servants, no commanding presence moved through the corridors to adjust, to correct, to remind. Sara Delano Roosevelt had passed, and the dawn that followed her death carried both stillness and disorientation. The family awoke to a world subtly altered, as though an invisible thread that had held everything taut had been gently cut in the night. Franklin felt the difference most keenly. For so long his mother had been his anchor, his critic, his guide, the one before whom he was always the boy of Hyde Park, never wholly the President of the United States. In her absence he felt both bereft and strangely unbound. The silence of the house pressed upon him, reminding him of loss, yet it also opened a space he had never fully known. Without Sara's presence, his relationship with Eleanor shifted subtly, her voice carrying greater weight, her independence no longer counterbalanced by the matriarch's authority. It was as though the morning light not only illuminated the rooms, but also revealed new paths within them, paths that had long been overshadowed by Sara's command. Eleanor, for her part, felt the change with a mixture of relief and melancholy. She had struggled for years under the weight of her mother-in-law's authority, her choices questioned, her independence constrained. With Sara's passing, that pressure lifted, and she found greater freedom to move, to act, to define herself without constant correction. Yet even in relief, she felt sorrow. Sara had been formidable, unyielding, often difficult, but she had also been deeply devoted to Franklin and the family. Her strength, however suffocating at times, had been real, and her absence left a void that could not be dismissed. Eleanor recognized, perhaps more clearly than ever, that her own growth had been shaped in resistance to Sara, that her independence had been forged in the crucible of rivalry. In mourning Sara, she mourned not only a person, but also the force against which she had defined herself. The house at Hyde Park became both memorial and inheritance. Each room carried traces of Sara, her furnishings, her portraits, her arrangements. To walk through the corridors was to walk through her memory. Franklin and Eleanor kept the house, tended the grounds, preserved the dignity she had so fiercely protected. Guests who visited after her death still spoke of her presence, as though it lingered in the air, a quiet authority woven into the very fabric of the place. Hyde Park had been her domain, and though she was gone, it remained marked by her will. Franklin continued in his public role, but privately he grieved. He wrote of his mother with affection, speaking of her strength, her devotion, her influence. He carried her memory into his speeches, his gestures, his very demeanor. When he smiled, when he held himself with dignity, when he reassured a nation with calm words, he carried Sara with him. She was gone, but she remained within him, inseparable from the man he had become. Her death had not ended her influence, it had only transformed it from presence into memory, from voice into echo. The morning light of Hyde Park, though soft, was not merely gentle. It also revealed the passage of time, the inevitability of change. The grandchildren, grown into their own lives, looked back upon their grandmother with reverence. They remembered her as stern but loving, commanding but protective. They spoke of her authority with a mixture of awe and affection, recognizing in her the figure who had guarded the family's continuity. For them, Sara was both memory and legacy, a reminder of where they had come from and of the weight of their name. Eleanor moved more fully into her own. Without Sara to overshadow her, she embraced her role as First Lady with even greater confidence. She traveled, she spoke, she wrote, she advocated. Her voice, once tentative, now rang with assurance. The absence of her mother-in-law did not create her strength, but it allowed it to be seen more clearly, unchallenged, unrestrained. Yet she did not erase Sara from memory. She honored her in her way, recognizing that even in rivalry, Sara had been part of the foundation upon which the family stood. Mourning at Hyde Park thus became a metaphor for the years that followed. Light breaking after darkness, continuity after loss, new beginnings born from endings. The house remained, the family endured, Franklin led, Eleanor grew. Yet all of it carried the imprint of Sara Delano Roosevelt, whose hand had guided for so long, whose authority had shaped every life around her. She was gone. Yet she remained, as matriarchs often do, in the habits, the memories, the traditions she left behind. The morning light grows brighter, casting long shadows that stretch toward the horizon, and within its glow we begin to see not only the house at Hyde Park, but the broader world into which Franklin now carried his leadership. For the influence of Sara did not end at her death. It lived on in the way he governed, in the way he faced the storms of depression and war. Her voice no longer whispered in his ear, but its echo still steadied his steps, guiding him even as he stood alone. The image of morning fades, and in its place rises the solemn vision of flags at half-mast, a nation in mourning, not for Sara, but for the son she had raised, for Franklin Delano Roosevelt himself, whose death would one day bring the story of mother and son to its final chapter. The solemn vision of flags at half-mast rises slowly before us, cloth stirring in the wind, their muted colors hanging against the grayness of a nation in mourning. It was April of 1945 when Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the boy of Hyde Park who had become the president of a nation through depression and war, breathed his last in Warm Springs, Georgia. The news spread quickly, carried by radio and by word of mouth, and across towns and cities the people wept. They wept not only for a leader, but for a presence that had given them courage through years of hardship. Yet within the private grief of family, another truth lingered, that behind the man they mourned had stood a mother whose influence had never wholly left him, even long after her own passing. Sara Delano Roosevelt was not alive to see her son's final day, yet the thread of her guidance, spun so carefully across his lifetime, still bound his memory. At Hyde Park, the family gathered once more, the house now both sanctuary and shrine. Eleanor stood with quiet composure, bearing the sorrow of widowhood with the same dignity she had shown through every trial. She thought perhaps of Sara, recalling how often she had felt overshadowed, how often she had struggled for space beneath that matriarch's authority. Now both Franklin and Sara were gone, and she was left the guardian of legacy, the custodian of memory. She had come into her own in life, and now, in death, she carried forward not only Franklin's story but also the shadow of the woman who had shaped him. For Eleanor understood, perhaps more than anyone, that Franklin had been the product of both loves, the protective love of Sara and the urging love of herself. The flags at half-mast marked not only the end of Franklin's presidency, but also the closing of a circle. He had fulfilled, in ways even Sara could not have envisioned, the destiny she had guarded from his infancy. She had seen him as a leader, as the heir to a great name, as a figure of dignity. Yet he had become more than that. He had become the voice of a people in despair, the embodiment of resilience in paralysis, the steady hand guiding a world at war. In his triumphs, one could hear Sara's echo, her insistence on composure, her lessons in bearing, her unyielding belief in his worth. Even in his failures, one could trace the shadow of her perfectionism, the weight of her expectations. Her influence did not end with her life. It carried through his and through him, into the nation itself. Those who came to Hyde Park after Franklin's death walked the grounds with reverence. They saw the house, the orchards, the river nearby, and they spoke of history. Yet within those walls still lingered the memory of a woman who had once commanded every detail, who had insisted upon order, who had guarded her son with ferocity. Guests remembered her with respect, sometimes with awe, sometimes with a faint tremor of unease, for Sara Delano Roosevelt had been a figure not easily forgotten. In the quiet corners of Hyde Park, her presence seemed almost tangible, as though her spirit lingered to ensure that even in death, her household remained as dignified as in life. Eleanor, now widowed, looked upon the house differently. Without Franklin, without Sara, it stood as both inheritance and burden. She preserved it not for herself, but for history, recognizing that the story of Hyde Park was larger than any one person. In doing so, she also preserved Sara's memory, for to erase the matriarch would be to erase part of Franklin himself. Eleanor may not have loved her mother-in-law, but she understood her importance, and she honored it in the way history demands, not with affection, but with acknowledgement. The flags at half-mast across the nation became symbols not only of Franklin's passing, but of the legacy of family influence. For behind every leader stands a web of unseen hands, shaping, guiding, molding. Sara's hand was among the strongest. Her life had been spent not in seeking her own renown, but in ensuring her son's. She had lived through the wealth of the Delanos, the marriage into the Roosevelts, the trials of widowhood, the shaping of a single child, and the watchful presence through his illness, marriage, and presidency. Her story was not separate from Franklin's, but woven into it, each thread inseparable from the other. It is tempting to ask in these closing moments whether Sara's influence was blessing or burden. Did her control stifle, or did it strengthen? Did her devotion protect, or did it limit? The truth lies in the paradox that it did both. Franklin was who he was because of her, not wholly in praise and not wholly in critique, but in the complex way that maternal influence always is. Her love was fierce, sometimes suffocating, sometimes sustaining. It made him both dependent and resilient, both cautious and confident. And in that paradox lies the secret influence of Sara Delano Roosevelt, the mother behind a president, both admired and resented, both blessing and burden, both unseen and undeniable. The flags at half-mast ripple softly in the wind, their fabric lifting and falling like breath. As the nation mourns its president, we return in imagination to the cradle in Hyde Park, where a mother once bent low over her only child, whispering words of devotion and of destiny. That whisper carried across decades, across crises, across triumphs, until it ended in the stillness of warm springs and in the mourning of a nation. Yet even then, it did not vanish. It lingers still in the memory of Hyde Park, in the story of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and in the history of a country shaped in part by the unyielding will of a mother who never let go. And so the story closes not with a proclamation, but with an image. The quiet fields of Hyde Park at dusk, the house standing still against the fading light, the echo of voices long departed, lingering in its rooms. The matriarch has gone. The president has gone. Yet their presence remains, woven into the fabric of memory, as enduring as the land itself, as timeless as the toll of a clock at midnight.